The heavy oak door slammed with such force that the family portraits hanging in the hallway rattled against their frames. 22-year-old Emma Richardson stood frozen on the marble steps of the only home she had ever known, her suitcase clutched in trembling hands as her mother's final words echoed in her mind like a death sentence. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. You are no daughter of mine. Don't you dare come crawling back. When reality hits you. The October wind whipped through the elm trees lining Beacon Hill, sending golden leaves swirling around Emma's feet as she stared up at the imposing brownstone that had housed 5 generations of Richardsons. Every window was now dark to her, every comfort stripped away in the span of one devastating conversation that had changed everything. Behind those walls lived Victoria Richardson, Boston's most formidable society matron, a woman who had built her reputation on maintaining the family's spotless image through 3 decades of careful social maneuvering. The Richardson name appeared on hospital wings, museum plaques, and charity foundation boards throughout the city. Victoria had spent her entire adult life ensuring that her family's legacy remained untarnished by scandal or whisper of impropriety, and now her only daughter carried a secret that could destroy everything Victoria had worked to preserve. Emma pressed her hand to her still flat stomach, where a life no bigger than a poppy seed was growing. 6 weeks. That's how long she had carried this secret, this impossible reality that had turned her world upside down and cost her everything she had ever known. The pregnancy wasn't the result of some wild rebellion or careless mistake. It was the product of love, pure and desperate, with someone her mother would never accept under any circumstances. Someone whose very existence in Emma's life represented everything Victoria Richardson despised about the changing world around them. Thomas McKenna had arrived in Boston 3 months earlier as part of a construction crew hired to restore the historic brownstones in Emma's neighborhood. While other society daughters hurried past the working men without a glance, Emma had been drawn to the quiet dignity of the young foreman who directed his crew with patient authority and treated everyone around him with equal respect. Thomas was everything the men in Emma's social circle were not. Where they were soft from lives of privilege, he was hardened by honest labor. Where they spoke in careful platitudes designed to avoid offense, he offered genuine thoughts and authentic emotions. Where they saw Emma as an ornament to be acquired, Thomas saw her as a person worthy of deep conversation and real understanding. Their first conversation had occurred when Emma stepped outside to escape a particularly tedious garden party her mother was hosting for the ladies' auxiliary. Thomas was working alone in the fading evening light, carefully repointing the mortar between ancient bricks with the precision of someone who understood the value of preserving beautiful things. "It's remarkable how much history these buildings hold," Emma had said. Genuinely curious about the restoration process, she had been watching from her bedroom window for weeks. Thomas looked up from his work, his weathered hands pausing in their careful movements. Most people in this neighborhood treated his crew like furniture, necessary but invisible. The fact that someone was actually interested in their craftsmanship caught him off guard. "Each brick tells a story," he replied, setting down his tools and giving her his full attention. "This building has survived the Civil War, 2 world wars, the Depression. The families who lived here faced challenges we can barely imagine, but they built something meant to last." The conversation that followed revealed a man who read voraciously despite never having attended college, who understood history and architecture with the passion of someone who worked with his hands to preserve the past for future generations. Emma found herself drawn back to these evening conversations, discovering in Thomas a depth of character that the Harvard-educated men her mother preferred utterly lacked. What began as intellectual curiosity evolved into something deeper when Emma realized that Thomas listened to her actual thoughts rather than simply waiting for his turn to speak. He asked questions about her dreams, her observations about the world, her opinions on books and ideas. For the first time in her life, Emma felt truly seen and valued for who she was rather than what she represented. The physical attraction that developed was inevitable, given the emotional connection they had forged. But their relationship remained careful and respectful until the night of the charity gala, when Emma's world had come crashing down in a different way entirely. Victoria Richardson had spent months planning the annual Richardson Foundation charity auction, an event that brought together Boston's most prominent families to raise money for various philanthropic causes. Emma was expected to serve as the perfect hostess daughter, charming potential donors while demonstrating the family's commitment to social responsibility. The evening had proceeded flawlessly until Emma overheard a conversation between her mother and Margaret Whitmore, the wife of Boston's most powerful banking family. They were discussing the problem of Thomas and his crew working in such close proximity to the neighborhood's young ladies. "It's unseemly," Margaret was saying, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to having her opinions treated as fact. "These working-class men have no business in our neighborhood beyond their specific duties. Some of them are quite attractive, and you know how impressionable young women can be." Victoria's response had chilled Emma to the bone. "Don't worry about that, Margaret. I've already spoken to the construction company about keeping their men focused on their work. And I've made it clear to Emma that any interaction with the workers beyond basic politeness would be completely inappropriate for someone in her position." The casual dismissal of Thomas's worth as a human being, the assumption that he was somehow dangerous simply because he worked with his hands, the complete disregard for Emma's ability to make her own judgments about people, all of it crystallized everything Emma had come to hate about her mother's narrow worldview. That night, Emma had sought out Thomas with a desperation that surprised them both. She found him cleaning his tools in the small trailer that served as the crew's headquarters, and the conversation that followed had laid bare the impossible gulf between their worlds. "My mother thinks you're beneath me," Emma had said, her voice shaking with anger and frustration. "She thinks I'm too fragile and impressionable to be trusted around someone who actually works for a living." Thomas had set down his tools slowly, his expression growing distant in a way Emma had never seen before. "Maybe she's right," he said quietly. "Maybe the differences between us are too great to overcome." "Don't you dare," Emma had replied fiercely. "Don't you dare let her small-minded prejudices define what we mean to each other." What happened next had been inevitable, given the emotional intensity of the moment and the weeks of growing attraction between them. In the quiet darkness of the construction trailer, surrounded by the tools of Thomas's honest trade, Emma had given herself completely to the only man who had ever seen her as more than a society ornament. The encounter had been tender and passionate, born of genuine love rather than mere physical desire. Thomas had been gentle with her inexperience, patient with her nervousness, completely focused on her comfort and pleasure rather than his own needs. For the first time in her life, Emma had felt truly alive, truly connected to another human, being in a way that transcended social expectations and family obligations. The consequences of that night had become clear 6 weeks later when Emma missed her monthly cycle and experienced the telltale symptoms she had heard whispered about among married women at social gatherings. A discreet visit to a doctor in a different part of the city had confirmed what she already knew in her heart. She was carrying Thomas McKenna's child. The construction project had ended the following week, and Thomas had moved on to another job site across the city. Emma had no way to contact him immediately, and the weight of her secret had grown heavier with each passing day. She knew she would have to tell her mother eventually, but she had hoped to find Thomas first, to share the news with him before facing Victoria's inevitable fury. That hope had been shattered when Emma's personal maid, Sarah, had discovered her vomiting early one morning and put together the obvious pieces. Sarah had been with the Richardson family for 15 years, and her loyalty was to Victoria rather than to Emma. By afternoon, Victoria had been informed of her daughter's condition. The confrontation that followed had exceeded even Emma's worst expectations. Victoria's rage had been cold and calculated, more devastating than any screaming fit could have been. She had dissected Emma's choices with surgical precision, laying bare the full extent of the social and financial catastrophe that an illegitimate pregnancy represented. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Victoria had asked, her voice deadly quiet as she paced the length of the drawing room. "Do you understand that this single act of selfishness has destroyed everything our family has built over 5 generations?" Emma had tried to explain about Thomas, about the love they shared, about the possibility that they could marry and build a life together. But Victoria had dismissed every attempt at explanation with brutal efficiency. Marriage to a common laborer? Victoria had laughed, the sound sharp and bitter. Even if such a union were socially possible, which it absolutely is not, do you think some construction worker has the means to support you in the manner you're accustomed to? Do you think he could provide for a child's education, medical care, proper social connections? The questions had hit their mark because Emma had no answers for them. She knew nothing about Thomas's financial situation, his family background, his long-term prospects. Their relationship had been built on emotional and intellectual connection, with practical considerations pushed aside in favor of the overwhelming feeling that they belonged together. "You will go to Switzerland immediately," Victoria had continued, her tone making it clear that this was not a discussion but a pronouncement of sentence. "There are discreet facilities there that handle situations like yours. You will remain there until the matter is resolved, and then you will return to Boston with this unfortunate episode forgotten." The suggestion that Emma should simply eliminate the life growing inside her had hit like a physical blow. Whatever mistakes she had made, whatever social conventions she had violated, the idea of destroying the child created from her love for Thomas was unthinkable. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "I won't do that," Emma had said, her voice stronger than she felt. "I won't destroy this baby because you're embarrassed by the circumstances of its conception." Victoria's facade of controlled anger had finally cracked, revealing the full extent of her fury and disappointment. "Then you will do it somewhere else, with someone else's money and someone else's name. You are no longer welcome in this house. And you are no longer my daughter. You have chosen your path, Emma. Now you can live with the consequences." The ultimatum had been delivered with such finality that Emma knew there would be no reprieve, no opportunity for reconciliation. Victoria Richardson had built her life on maintaining appearances and an illegitimate grandchild from a liaison with a working-class man represented a stain on the family reputation that she would never accept. Emma had been given exactly 1 hour to pack her belongings and leave the house. Victoria had withdrawn all financial support, closed Emma's bank accounts, and made it clear that any attempt to use the Richardson name for credit or assistance would be met with legal action. Now, standing on the street where she had played as a child, Emma faced a reality that seemed impossible to navigate. She had less than $50 in her purse, no job skills that would support her in the working world, and no friends outside the social circle that would now be forbidden to her. Her pregnancy would become obvious within months, making employment even more difficult to secure. More immediately pressing was the need for shelter. The October evening was growing cold, and Emma's lightweight traveling coat offered little protection against the wind. The elegant neighborhood around her was filled with people who knew her family, making it impossible to seek help without word getting back to Victoria. Emma began walking toward the business district, her suitcase growing heavier with each block. She had enough money for perhaps a week in a modest boarding house, but after that, she would need to find some form of employment or face genuine destitution. The boarding houses in the working-class section of the city were a revelation to someone who had never seen how the other half lived. The rooms were tiny and sparsely furnished. The hallways smelled of boiled cabbage and industrial soap, and the other residents looked at Emma's expensive clothes with suspicion and barely concealed resentment. Mrs. Kowalski, the elderly Polish woman who ran the boarding house Emma finally settled on, quoted a weekly rate that would exhaust Emma's funds within 10 days. But the room was clean, the building was safe, and Mrs. Kowalski asked no questions about Emma's circumstances beyond requiring payment in advance. That first night, lying on a narrow bed with a thin mattress, Emma faced the full magnitude of what she had lost and what she was facing. The life growing inside her was still too small to feel, but its presence dominated every thought about her future. She needed to find Thomas, needed to tell him about the pregnancy, needed to discover whether the love they had shared could survive the harsh realities of trying to build a life together without family support or financial resources. But first, she needed to survive long enough to make that conversation possible. The Boston she had known as Victoria Richardson's daughter was a world of charity luncheons, museum galas, and carefully orchestrated social interactions. The Boston she now faced as a pregnant woman with no family connections was a place of employment agencies, factory work, and the constant threat of destitution. Emma pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders and tried to imagine a future that didn't seem to exist. Somewhere in this vast and different city, Thomas McKenna was going about his life, unaware that the woman he had loved was carrying his child and facing a world that had no place for either of them. The sound of rain beginning to fall against the boarding house window seemed to echo the tears Emma refused to let herself shed. Tomorrow she would begin the process of trying to build a life from nothing. Tonight, she could only hold on to the hope that love might somehow be enough to overcome the impossible obstacles that lay ahead. In 9 months, she would bring Thomas's child into a world that had already rejected them both. But perhaps, if she could find him, if they could find each other, they might discover that being cast out from one world could be the beginning of building a better one together. The employment agency on Washington Street smelled of desperation and broken dreams. Emma sat on a hard wooden chair, her carefully mended gloves hiding hands that had never known manual labor, while women in patched coats clutched letters of recommendation from previous employers. The clerk behind the desk, a sharp-faced woman named Miss Patterson, looked Emma up and down with barely concealed skepticism. "No previous employment experience," Miss Patterson repeated, tapping her pencil against Emma's nearly blank application. "No references from domestic positions, no factory experience. Tell me, Miss Richardson, what exactly can you do?" Emma fought the urge to mention her fluency in French, her knowledge of art history, or her skill at organizing charity events. None of those accomplishments would translate into paying work for a woman who needed to support herself immediately. "I can read and write well," Emma offered. "I've managed household accounts and correspondence. I'm reliable and quick to learn." Miss Patterson's expression suggested she had heard similar claims from hundreds of desperate women. "Shop girl positions require standing for 12 hours a day and dealing with difficult customers. Factory work involves dangerous machinery and quotas that many girls can't meet. Domestic service means living in someone else's home and following their rules completely." Each option sounded impossible to someone who had never worked a day in her life, but Emma nodded as if she could handle any of them. The truth was that she would have to handle whatever she could get, because her money was running out faster than anticipated. The boarding house took most of her remaining funds, and food cost more than she had ever imagined when someone else wasn't providing it automatically. Emma had been shocked to discover that a simple meal of bread and soup could consume what seemed like a significant portion of her limited resources. "There might be something at Hartwell's department store," Miss Patterson said finally. "There looking for girls with decent handwriting for their correspondence department. The pay is low, but it's respectable work for someone of your background. Emma accepted the referral letter gratefully, though she noticed Miss Patterson's careful wording. Even in her reduced circumstances, Emma's accent and bearing marked her as someone who had fallen from a higher station rather than someone born to this level of struggle. Hartwell's department store occupied an entire city block, its windows filled with displays of fashionable clothes and household goods that Emma had once purchased without thinking about their cost. Now, walking through the employee entrance, she saw the store from an entirely different perspective. The correspondence department was located in the basement, a windowless room filled with dozens of young women bent over desks writing responses to customer complaints and inquiries. The supervisor, Mrs. Chen, was a no-nonsense woman who had clearly worked her way up from the floor positions. "You'll be answering letters from customers who have problems with their orders," Mrs. Chun explained, leading Emma to a small desk near the back of the room. "Some are reasonable complaints that require diplomatic responses. Others are from people who think they can intimidate us into giving them something for nothing. Your job is to maintain the store's reputation while protecting its interests." The work was tedious but not difficult for someone with Emma's education. She found herself crafting polite responses to angry customers, explaining store policies to confused shoppers, and occasionally writing the kind of gracious apology letters that turned complaints into continued business relationships. What Emma hadn't anticipated was how physically exhausting the work would be. Sitting at a desk for 10 hours a day, writing by hand with only brief breaks for meals, left her with aching shoulders and cramped fingers. By the end of her first week, she understood why the other girls looked so worn down despite their youth. The salary was exactly what Mrs. Chun had promised, barely enough to cover rent and basic food if Emma was careful with every penny. There was nothing left over for clothing, medical care, or any of the small comforts that made life bearable. Emma's expensive dresses began showing signs of daily wear, and she learned to mend tears and replace buttons with supplies bought from the store's remnant bins. More challenging than the physical demands was the social isolation Emma experienced among her co-workers. The other girls in the correspondence department were friendly enough, but they came from working-class families and had little in common with someone whose previous concerns had centered around which charity luncheon to attend. During lunch breaks, they talked about their families, their boyfriends, their plans for weekend entertainment that cost almost nothing. Emma listened but couldn't contribute stories about her own background without revealing how far she had fallen. Instead, she invented a vague history about growing up in a small town and coming to Boston to make her own way. The pregnancy added another layer of complexity to her daily survival. Emma was now approaching 3 months, and while her condition wasn't yet visible, the morning sickness was becoming more difficult to hide. She had taken to arriving at work early so she could be sick in the employee washroom before anyone else arrived, and she kept crackers in her desk drawer to settle her stomach throughout the day. Dr. Walsh, the physician Emma consulted at a free clinic, confirmed what she already knew while delivering news that made her financial situation even more precarious. The baby was healthy and developing normally, but Emma would need better nutrition, prenatal vitamins she couldn't afford, and time off work as her pregnancy progressed. "You'll need to stop working by your 7th month," Dr. Walsh advised. "And you should be prepared for at least 6 weeks of recovery after the birth before you can return to employment." The timeline Dr. Walsh outlined represented a financial impossibility. Emma had no savings to support herself during months of unemployment, no family to provide assistance, and no clear plan for caring for an infant while maintaining the job she needed for survival. It was during her darkest moment, sitting in her boarding house room calculating how long her money would last, that Emma made a decision that would change everything. She would find Thomas McKenna, tell him about the pregnancy, and discover whether the love they had shared could provide a foundation for building a life together. The construction company that had employed Thomas proved surprisingly helpful when Emma explained that she needed to contact him about a family matter. The foreman, a gruff man named Murphy, remembered Thomas well and provided the address of his current job site across the city. Emma used her lunch break to make the journey, her heart pounding with anticipation and fear as she approached the construction site where Thomas was working. She hadn't seen him in nearly 3 months, and she wasn't sure how he would react to her unexpected appearance, much less to the news she carried. She found him directing a crew installing steel beams for a new office building, his voice carrying clearly as he coordinated the complex operation. Thomas looked exactly as she remembered, strong, competent, completely absorbed in work that required both physical skill and mental precision. Watching him, Emma felt a rush of the same attraction that had drawn her to him originally. When Thomas noticed her standing at the edge of the construction site, his expression shifted from surprise to concern. He immediately handed his responsibilities to another worker and approached her with the quick stride of someone accustomed to responding to emergencies. "Emma," he said, his voice filled with genuine warmth despite his obvious confusion. "What are you doing here? Is everything all right?" The simple question nearly undid Emma's carefully maintained composure. Nothing was all right, and seeing Thomas again made her realize how much she had been hoping he could somehow make everything better. "I need to talk to you," she said, glancing around at the busy construction site. "Somewhere private, if possible." Thomas led her to a small office trailer at the edge of the site, clearing blueprints and work orders from a chair so she could sit down. His concern was evident as he took in her appearance, the same expensive clothes now showing wear, the careful way she moved that suggested she wasn't feeling well, the underlying tension that marked someone operating under significant stress. "You look tired," Thomas said gently, "and you've lost weight. Has something happened with your family?" Emma realized that Thomas had no way of knowing about her changed circumstances. In his mind, she was still the privileged society daughter who had sought him out for evening conversations during his work in her neighborhood. The idea that she might be supporting herself through manual labor wouldn't have occurred to him. "Everything has changed," Emma said, struggling to find words that could encompass the magnitude of her situation. "My mother discovered our relationship and threw me out of the house. I've been working at Hartwell's department store, living in a boarding house. I have no family, no money, no future that I can see." Thomas's expression shifted from concern to shock as he processed the implications of what she was telling him. He moved closer, reaching for her hands with the same gentle care she remembered from their time together. "Why didn't you contact me immediately?" he asked. "I would never have let you face this alone if I had known." The question Emma had been dreading could no longer be avoided. She looked into Thomas's eyes, seeing the same honest strength that had first attracted her, and hoped it would be enough to handle what she needed to tell him. "There's more," she said quietly. "I'm pregnant, Thomas. I'm carrying your child." The silence that followed seemed to stretch forever. Emma watched Thomas's face as he processed this information, seeing surprise give way to understanding, and then to something that looked like determination. "How long?" he asked finally. 3 months. The baby will come in spring." Thomas stood and walked to the window of the trailer, looking out at the construction site where his crew continued their work. Emma couldn't read his expression, and the silence grew heavy with possibilities she didn't want to consider. When Thomas turned back to her, his decision was clear in every line of his posture. "We'll be married immediately," he said. "I'll find you a place to live, and you can stop working until after the baby comes. I make enough to support a family if we're careful." The relief that flooded through Emma was so intense it left her dizzy. For months, she'd been carrying the weight of her situation alone, imagining futures that ranged from desperate to impossible. Thomas's immediate acceptance of responsibility offered hope she hadn't dared to believe in. "Are you certain?" she asked. "Marriage to me means taking on problems that aren't your fault. My family will never accept you, and I can't bring anything to a marriage except the scandal I've already created." Thomas knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his work-roughened ones. "Emma, I fell in love with you when I thought you were completely out of my reach. Do you think I'm going to let pride or social conventions keep us apart now that there's a chance we can build a real life together?" The wedding took place 3 days later in a small church Thomas attended, with only the priest and 2 witnesses present. Emma wore a simple blue dress purchased with her last week's wages, and Thomas borrowed a suit from his boarding house roommate. The ceremony was nothing like the elaborate society wedding Victoria Richardson had once planned for her daughter, but Emma had never felt happier than when Thomas slipped a simple gold band onto her finger. Their first home was a 2-room apartment above a bakery in an Irish neighborhood where Thomas's reputation as a skilled worker had earned him acceptance despite his Scottish heritage. The rooms were tiny and simply furnished, but they were clean and warm, and Emma could smell fresh bread baking each morning when she woke up. The transformation from her mother's mansion to this modest apartment should have felt like a devastating loss of status and comfort. Instead, Emma discovered that having a home based on love rather than social expectations created a peace she had never experienced in all her years of privilege. Thomas proved to be everything Emma had hoped for as a husband. He was gentle with her physical discomfort as the pregnancy progressed, patient with her inexperience in managing a household on a strict budget, and completely supportive of her decision to leave her privileged past behind. "I never understood how much work goes into making a life," Emma confessed one evening as she struggled to prepare a simple dinner from ingredients that had to be stretched to last the week. "Everything was just provided for me before. I never thought about where it came from or what it cost." Thomas smiled, helping her salvage a pot of stew that had begun to stick to the bottom. "You're learning faster than most people would. And you're doing it while growing our child and adjusting to a completely different world. I'm proud of you." The validation meant everything to Emma, who had spent months feeling like a failure at the most basic tasks of independent living. Thomas's confidence in her abilities helped her find strength she hadn't known she possessed. As winter approached and Emma's pregnancy became obvious, they began making plans for their child's future. Thomas spoke of saving money for a house with a yard, of ensuring their children would have educational opportunities he had been denied, of building something lasting that could provide security for the family they were creating. "This baby will never doubt that it's wanted," Thomas said one evening as he felt the child moving in Emma's growing belly. "Whatever difficulties we face, our children will know they're loved completely." Emma pressed her hand over his, feeling the strength and steadiness that had drawn her to him originally. She thought about her mother's cold rejection, about the boarding house where she had faced destitution alone, about the fear that had dominated her life for months. All of that was behind her now. She was Emma McKenna, Thomas's wife, mother of the child they had created together. The future was uncertain, but it was theirs to build together, and that made all the difference. The Irish women of Southie had their own way of testing newcomers, and Emma McKenna quickly learned that her husband's reputation would only open the door. Her own character would determine whether she was truly accepted into the tight-knit community that surrounded their new home. Mrs. O'Malley, who ran the bakery below their apartment, was the unofficial queen of the neighborhood's social hierarchy. A widow who had raised 6 children while building a successful business, she commanded respect through a combination of sharp intelligence, generous heart, and absolutely no tolerance for pretense. Emma's first real test came during a bitter February morning when she was 6 months pregnant and struggling with a load of laundry too heavy for her condition. "Put that down before you hurt yourself and the baby," Mrs. O'Malley commanded, appearing In the bakery's back alley where Emma was hanging wet clothes on a line strung between buildings. What kind of husband lets his pregnant wife do heavy work like that? Emma bristled at the implied criticism of Thomas, who was working a double shift to earn extra money for the baby's needs. My husband works 16 hours a day to provide. For us, I can certainly manage my own household responsibilities. Mrs. O'Malley studied Emma with eyes that had seen every kind of hardship the neighborhood could offer. Pride is a luxury you can't afford when you're carrying a child. Come inside. I'll show you how to get help without begging for it. The lesson that followed introduced Emma to the complex network of mutual assistance that kept working-class families afloat during emergencies. Women traded services, babysitting for sewing, cooking for cleaning, nursing care for grocery shopping. The system required trust, reciprocity, and the willingness to ask for help when it was needed. You've got good handwriting and a fine way with words, Mrs. O'Malley observed after Emma helped her compose a letter to a supplier who had been overcharging for flour. Mrs. Kowalski down the street has been struggling with correspondence from her son in the army. Mrs. Chun at the laundry needs someone to write collection letters that don't sound threatening. There's work for someone with your skills if you're willing to do it. Emma discovered that her education, which had seemed useless in the factory and department store environment, was actually valuable in a community where many adults had limited literacy. She began spending her evenings helping neighbors write letters, fill out forms, and navigate bureaucratic requirements that could make the difference between receiving benefits and being denied assistance. The work brought in small amounts of money, but more importantly, it established Emma's place in the community as someone useful rather than simply Thomas's pregnant wife. The women who initially viewed her with suspicion began seeking her advice, sharing neighborhood gossip, and including her in the informal social networks that provided emotional support during difficult times. Emma's medical knowledge, gained through years of charity work with Boston's elite hospital boards, proved unexpectedly relevant when the Kowalski family's youngest daughter developed what appeared to be pneumonia. Dr. Murphy, the neighborhood's only physician, was attending a difficult birth across town, and the child's fever was climbing dangerously. Steam, Emma told Mrs. Kowalski, helping her position the little girl over a pot of boiling water with eucalyptus. Oil. We need to get the congestion moving before it settles deeper in her lungs. And cool cloths for the fever. We have to bring her temperature down. Emma spent the night at the Kowalski apartment, monitoring the child's breathing and applying techniques she had learned from observing wealthy families' private nurses. By morning, the fever had broken and the little girl was breathing easily, though she would need several more days of careful attention. "You saved my daughter's life," Mrs. Kowalski said simply, tears streaming down her face as she watched her child sleep peacefully for the first time in 3 days. Word of Emma's medical intervention spread through the neighborhood with the speed of all significant news in close-knit communities. Women began consulting her about their children's health problems, asking for advice about symptoms and home remedies. Emma was careful to recommend professional medical care for serious conditions, but her knowledge of basic nursing care filled a crucial gap in a community where doctor visits were expensive luxuries. The respect Emma gained through her contributions to community welfare extended to her relationship with Thomas, whose standing among his fellow workers was enhanced by having a wife who was genuinely helpful rather than simply decorative. The Irish construction crews operated on principles of loyalty and mutual support that Emma began to understand and appreciate as winter gave way to spring. When Thomas was injured in a scaffolding accident that left him with a dislocated shoulder and unable to work for 2 weeks, the response from his co-workers demonstrated the strength of bonds Emma had previously only seen among Boston's elite social circles. Men contributed money from their own wages to help cover the McKenna family's expenses, while their wives brought meals and offered assistance with household tasks Emma couldn't manage alone. This is what family looks like when you choose it. Instead of being born into it, Thomas explained as Emma marveled at the generosity of people who had little to spare. These men know I'd do the same for them if they were hurt. We look out for each other because we have to. The experience of receiving community support while Thomas recovered gave Emma her first real understanding of how working-class families survived crises that would devastate individuals trying to face them alone. The network of mutual aid wasn't based on charity or social obligation. It was a practical system for sharing risk among people who couldn't afford professional insurance or family trust funds. Emma's pregnancy progressed smoothly through the spring, with Dr. Murphy providing prenatal care that was basic but competent. The Irish women of the neighborhood offered advice based on their own experiences, teaching Emma about nutrition, exercise, and preparation for childbirth that no society doctor had ever discussed with the wealthy mothers she had known. Babies come when they're ready, not when it's convenient, Mrs. O'Malley observed during one of the informal gatherings that took place in the bakery's back room. Your job is to stay strong and trust your body to know what it's doing. Women have been having babies since the beginning of time without fancy hospitals and expensive doctors. The practical wisdom shared during these conversations proved more useful than the theoretical knowledge Emma had gained from books written by male physicians who had never experienced pregnancy themselves. She learned about managing discomfort, recognizing warning signs, and preparing mentally for the physical demands of labor and delivery. As spring turned to summer and Emma's due date approached, she realized that her life had become something she never could have imagined during her years as Victoria Richardson's daughter. She was genuinely happy in ways that had nothing to do with material comfort or social status. Her marriage to Thomas was built on partnership and mutual respect, rather than convenience or family alliance. Her place in the community was earned through contribution rather than inherited through birth. The transformation wasn't without challenges. Emma still occasionally missed the intellectual stimulation of her former social circle, the cultural events that had filled her calendar, the financial security that had made planning unnecessary. Some mornings, she woke up amazed that she was living in 2 rooms above a bakery, married to a construction worker, preparing to give birth to a child whose grandparents would never acknowledge its existence. But these moments of doubt were increasingly rare, overwhelmed by the satisfaction of a life that felt authentic in ways her privileged existence never had. Emma was contributing to her family's welfare and her community's well-being through her own efforts, rather than simply serving as an ornament to someone else's success. The letter that arrived in late June, addressed to Mrs. Emma McKenna in handwriting she recognized immediately, threatened to upset the equilibrium she had worked so hard to establish. Victoria Richardson had somehow tracked down her daughter's new address and circumstances, and the contents of her message would force Emma to confront the possibility that her past might not be as completely behind her as she had hoped. Emma read the letter while Thomas was at work, sitting in the small parlor of their apartment with afternoon sunlight streaming through windows that looked out on a world completely different from the one where she had grown up. Victoria's words were carefully chosen, revealing nothing that could be used against her if the letter fell into the wrong hands, but carrying implications that made Emma's blood run cold. The message was brief and to the point. Victoria was aware of Emma's marriage and pregnancy. She was prepared to offer financial assistance and social rehabilitation under specific conditions that would require Emma to make choices about loyalty, identity, and the future she was building with Thomas. For the first time since leaving Beacon Hill, Emma faced the possibility that her old life might intrude on her new one in ways that could threaten everything she had worked to create. The timing of Victoria's contact, just weeks before the baby's birth, suggested strategic planning. Rather than maternal concern, Emma folded the letter carefully and placed it in the small box where she kept important documents. Thomas would be home soon, and she would need to decide whether to share this development with him or handle it alone. The decision she made would affect not only her own future, but the future of their child and the life they were building together. In this community that had become her true home. Outside, the sounds of the neighborhood continued: children playing in the street, women calling to each other from windows, the familiar rhythm of working-class life that had become the backdrop for Emma's happiness. Whatever Victoria Richardson wanted, whatever threats or promises her letter contained, Emma was no longer the frightened, desperate girl who had been thrown out of a Beacon Hill mansion 9 months earlier. She was Emma McKenna now, Thomas's wife, a valued member of a community that respected her contributions, a woman preparing to bring new life into a world she had helped build through her own efforts. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them from a position of strength rather than desperation, supported by people who cared about her, for who she had become rather than who she used to be. The baby moved inside her as if responding to her thoughts, a reminder that the future she was protecting involved more than just her own happiness. Soon, she would be holding Thomas's child, and that child would grow up in this neighborhood, among these people, as part of the community Emma had found when she thought she had lost everything that mattered. Victoria Richardson's letter might represent a threat to that future, but it also represented an opportunity to choose, once and for all, which world Emma wanted to claim as her own. The labor shortage that hit Boston's construction industry in July 1923 came without warning, triggered by a massive railroad project that drew skilled workers from across New England with promises of higher wages and steady employment through the winter. Within 2 weeks, Thomas found himself promoted from crew member to foreman, responsible for completing a critical bridge project with half his usual workforce. The promotion brought desperately needed extra income just as Emma entered her final month of pregnancy, but it also meant 16-hour days and the kind of pressure that left Thomas exhausted and worried about meeting deadlines that could make or break his career. The bridge project was a showcase job that would demonstrate Boston's engineering capabilities to potential investors in future infrastructure development. If we finish this on time and under budget, it could mean permanent work for everyone on the crew, Thomas explained to Emma as he prepared for another dawn-to-dusk shift. But if we fail, the construction company loses the contract in half. The men in Southie will be looking for work come fall. Emma watched her husband shoulder responsibilities that would have overwhelmed men with twice his experience, managing not just the technical challenges of bridge construction, but the complex personalities of workers desperate to keep their jobs. The stress was visible in the lines around Thomas's eyes, the careful way he moved his still tender shoulder, and the distracted manner that marked someone carrying more weight than they could comfortably bear. The community pressure extended beyond Thomas's immediate crew. The Irish families of Southie had invested their hopes for economic stability in the success of men like Thomas, who had earned positions of authority within the construction industry. Failure on the bridge project would ripple through the entire neighborhood, affecting wives, children, and elderly relatives who depended on steady wages for survival. Mrs. O'Malley expressed the community's concerns during one of her morning conversations with Emma. The men are scared, though they won't admit it. This bridge job represents everything they've worked for, a chance to prove they can handle the big projects that used to go to crews from other parts of the city. If Thomas can pull this off, it changes how people see Irish workers. The weight of representing not just his own family's future, but his entire community's aspirations was something Thomas carried with characteristic determination, but obvious strain. Emma found herself taking on additional responsibilities to reduce the pressure on her husband, managing household finances, coordinating with neighbors about shared childcare arrangements, and handling the correspondence work that had become an important source of supplemental income. Emma's growing reputation as someone who could navigate bureaucratic complexities led to an unexpected opportunity when Father Michael Sullivan, the parish priest, approached her about helping resolve a crisis that threatened to close the neighborhood's only school. The city had changed regulations regarding teacher certification, and several of the women who had been teaching the neighborhood children no longer met the new requirements. The school board is looking for any excuse to shut us down and redistribute our children to schools across the city, Father Sullivan explained during a meeting in the church basement. They claim it's about educational standards, but everyone knows it's about removing Irish families from this neighborhood to make room for development projects. The threat of school closure represented more than just educational disruption. It was part of a larger pattern of pressure designed to force working-class families out of areas that developers wanted for commercial projects. Without local schools, families would be forced to send their children across the city or move to neighborhoods where they couldn't afford the rent. Emma discovered that her ability to write persuasive letters and navigate official channels made her uniquely qualified to help fight the school closure. She spent her evenings researching education law, writing appeals to the school board, and coordinating with other neighborhood advocates to present a unified response to the bureaucratic challenges. The work connected Emma with Margaret Flynn, a schoolteacher who had been fighting similar battles across the city. Margaret was a formidable woman in her 40s who had parlayed her education into a position of influence within Boston's Irish community. She recognized Emma's potential immediately and drew her into a network of women working to protect their neighborhoods from various forms of institutional pressure. "You have skills that most of us lack," Margaret told Emma during one of their strategy sessions. "You understand how the wealthy think, how they make decisions, what arguments will actually influence them. That knowledge is valuable to communities like ours that are usually ignored when policies are made." Through Margaret, Emma learned about the broader forces threatening working-class neighborhoods throughout Boston. Real estate speculators were using zoning changes, building code enforcement, and school closures to drive down property values and force out longtime residents. The process was systematic and well-funded, designed to clear the way for commercial development that would benefit investors while displacing families who had lived in these areas for generations. The revelation that her mother's social circle was likely involved in these development schemes added personal urgency to Emma's community advocacy work. She recognized the methods being used against Southie from charity board meetings she had attended as Victoria Richardson's daughter, where similar urban improvement projects had been discussed as necessary steps toward modernizing the city. Emma's pregnancy reached its final weeks, just as the crisis involving the school and Thomas's bridge project reached critical stages. Dr. Murphy warned her that the stress she was experiencing could complicate her delivery. But Emma found it impossible to step back from work that felt essential to protecting the life she and Thomas were building. The baby's arrival began during a particularly chaotic evening when Thomas was working late to meet a crucial deadline, and Emma was hosting a meeting of women organizing petitions to save the school. The first contractions were mild enough that Emma continued taking notes and serving tea to the dozen neighbors crowded into her small parlor. Mrs. O'Malley was the first to notice that Emma was having difficulty concentrating on the discussion about teacher certification requirements. "How long have you been having pains?" she asked quietly, moving to sit beside Emma during a break in the meeting. "Since this afternoon," Emma admitted. "But they're not regular yet," and Dr. Murphy said, "First babies usually take their time." Within an hour, it became clear that Emma's labor was progressing more quickly than expected. The meeting dissolved as the neighborhood women shifted into the coordinated response that marked their approach to any crisis requiring immediate action. Someone was sent to fetch Dr. Murphy. Another woman went to find Thomas at the construction site, and Mrs. O'Malley took charge of preparing Emma's bedroom for the delivery. "This baby has its own ideas about timing," Mrs. O'Malley observed as she helped Emma through increasingly intense contractions. "Seems fitting, given how much planning you've been doing for everyone else's problems." Thomas arrived just as Dr. Murphy was setting up his medical equipment, his face showing the panic of someone who had run several miles through city streets after receiving word that his wife was in labor. The sight of Emma managing her contractions with the same determination she brought to community organizing seemed to both reassure and amaze him. "I should have been here," Thomas said, taking Emma's hand as another wave of pain crested. "You're here now," Emma replied, focusing on the breathing techniques Mrs. O'Malley had taught her. "And tomorrow we'll have our child, and next week you'll finish the bridge, and somehow we'll figure out how to save the school." The birth of Michael Thomas McKenna at 3:47 a.m. on July 28, 1923, marked the culmination of everything Emma had worked toward since being thrown out of her mother's house nearly a year earlier. Holding her son for the first time, with Thomas beside her and the neighborhood women who had become her true family surrounding them both, Emma felt a completeness she had never experienced during her years of privilege. The baby was healthy and strong, with Thomas's dark hair and Emma's determined chin. Dr. Murphy pronounced the delivery successful and mother and child in excellent condition. The celebration that followed, with neighbors streaming through the apartment to meet the newest member of their community, demonstrated the bonds Emma had forged through her contributions to their collective welfare. But even as Emma marveled at her son's perfect features and Thomas's obvious pride in becoming a father, she remained aware of the challenges that would shape Michael's future. The bridge project still needed to be completed on schedule. The school fight required continued attention, and Victoria Richardson's letter remained unanswered in the box where Emma kept important documents. The arrival of her grandson would likely intensify Victoria's interest in reestablishing contact with Emma, possibly with offers of financial support that would come with conditions designed to draw Emma back into the Richardson family orbit. The timing of such overtures, just when Emma had achieved stability and happiness in her new life, would force difficult decisions about loyalty, identity, and the future she wanted for her child. Thomas, exhausted from work stress and the emotional intensity of becoming a father, fell asleep holding his son while Emma lay awake, thinking about the forces that could threaten their fragile happiness. Outside, the sounds of early morning in Southie were beginning. Bakers starting their ovens, construction workers heading to job sites, children playing in streets that would be filled with life and energy within a few hours. This was the world Emma wanted her son to inherit, a community where people looked out for each other, where hard work was respected, where a person's worth was measured by their contributions rather than their bank account. But protecting that inheritance would require continued vigilance against forces that saw neighborhoods like Southie as obstacles to progress rather than communities worth preserving. Michael stirred in his father's arms, making the small sounds that would soon develop into demands for attention, feeding, and comfort. Emma smiled, watching her husband and son sleep peacefully despite all the uncertainties that surrounded their future. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together as a family, supported by the community that had embraced them. Both. The private investigator arrived in Southie on a Tuesday morning in September, dressed in clothes expensive enough to mark him as an outsider, but modest enough to avoid drawing immediate attention. William Hartwell was a professional who specialized in what he euphemistically called family matters for Boston's elite, and his presence in the Irish neighborhood meant that someone with significant resources was taking a serious interest in the McKenna family's affairs. Emma first noticed him while walking Michael to the corner market, a routine she had established to introduce her 2-month-old son to the rhythm of neighborhood life. The stranger was standing across from the bakery, apparently reading a newspaper, but his attention was clearly focused on the building where the McKennas lived. Something about his careful observation and expensive shoes triggered alarm bells. In Emma's mind, Mrs. McKenna, Mrs. O'Malley, called from the bakery doorway. "You might want to know that man has been asking questions about your family." Nothing threatening, but curious enough to make people uncomfortable. The news that someone was investigating her background sent a chill through Emma, that had nothing to do with the autumn weather. She had been expecting some response from Victoria Richardson since sending a brief note announcing Michael's birth, but she hadn't anticipated her mother would hire professional surveillance to gather information about her current circumstances. Emma's suspicions were confirmed when Margaret Flynn arrived at the apartment that evening with disturbing news from her contacts in city government. Someone had been requesting records related to Emma's marriage, Thomas's employment history, and the McKenna family's rental agreement for their apartment above the bakery. The requests were made through a law firm that represents several of Boston's wealthiest families, Margaret explained, bouncing Michael on her knee while Emma prepared tea. They're being very careful to stay within legal boundaries, but the pattern suggests someone is building a comprehensive picture of your life here. The implications were deeply troubling. Victoria Richardson wasn't simply curious about her daughter's welfare. She was conducting the kind of thorough investigation that preceded legal action or coordinated pressure campaigns. Emma's experience with her mother's methods suggested that Victoria was preparing to make some kind of move that would require detailed knowledge of Emma's vulnerabilities. Thomas's reaction when Emma shared this information revealed the depth of his protective instincts regarding his new family. His initial anger at the invasion of their privacy quickly shifted to practical concern about what such investigation might be intended to accomplish. "What does your mother want?" Thomas asked, holding Michael while Emma paced their small parlor. "If she's spending money on private investigators, she has some specific goal in mind." Emma had been dreading this question since receiving Victoria's first letter, because she suspected the answer would force her to confront choices she wasn't ready to make. Victoria Richardson didn't invest time or resources without expecting specific returns, and her interest in Emma's current situation likely involved plans that would require Emma to choose between her old life and her new one. The answer came in the form of a formal letter, delivered by messenger 2 days later. Victoria's proposal was presented with the clinical precision that marked all her strategic communications, offering specific benefits in exchange for specific actions that would fundamentally alter the trajectory Emma had chosen for her life. Victoria was prepared to establish a trust fund for Michael's education, provide a substantial monthly allowance for Emma's living expenses, and arrange for Thomas to receive a management position with a construction company owned by Richardson Family Associates. The only conditions were that Emma and her family relocate to a more respectable neighborhood, that Emma resume using her maiden name for social purposes, and that she gradually reintroduce herself to Boston society as a young widow who had remarried. After a brief period of grief, the offer was carefully constructed to appear generous while actually representing a complete erasure of the life Emma had built in Southie. Accepting Victoria's terms would mean abandoning the community that had embraced her, denying the authenticity of her relationship with Thomas, and raising Michael in an environment where his father's working-class background would be treated as something shameful to be overcome. But the offer also represented financial security that Emma couldn't ignore. The trust fund would ensure Michael's access to educational opportunities that would otherwise be impossible on Thomas's construction. Wages. The monthly allowance would eliminate the constant financial stress that marked working-class life. And the position offered to Thomas would provide professional advancement that might take decades to achieve through normal channels. "She's trying to buy us," Thomas said after reading Victoria's letter. "Make us financially dependent on her so she can control how we live and how we raise our son." Emma recognized the accuracy of Thomas's assessment, but she also understood the powerful appeal of Victoria's offer. The love she felt for Michael made her want to provide him with every possible advantage, and the resources Victoria was offering could transform their son's future in ways that pure determination couldn't match. The pressure to consider Victoria's proposal was intensified by developments in the neighborhood that highlighted the precarious nature of working-class security. The bridge project that had consumed Thomas's attention for months hit a critical snag when city inspectors discovered structural problems that required expensive modifications. The delay threatened to push completion past the contract deadline, which would result in financial penalties that could bankrupt the construction company. Thomas found himself working 20-hour days trying to solve engineering problems while managing crews frustrated by the uncertainty surrounding their continued employment. The stress was visible in his exhaustion, his shortened temper, and the way he held Michael as if his son represented the only stable thing in an increasingly chaotic world. The school closure fight that Emma had been leading faced similar setbacks. When the city school board accelerated their timeline for implementing new certification requirements, several of the neighborhood's most experienced teachers would be forced to stop working within weeks unless they completed certification programs they couldn't afford to attend. "They're trying to force us out from multiple directions, Margaret," Flynn observed during an emergency meeting of community advocates. "Attack the jobs, attack the schools, attack the social services that make it possible for working families to survive in these neighborhoods." Emma found herself caught between her commitment to fighting for her community and her growing awareness that Victoria's offer might represent the only way to protect Michael from the broader forces threatening working-class families throughout Boston. The financial resources Victoria was promising could shield her son from the kind of economic uncertainty that made every month a struggle for survival. The investigators continued. Presence in the neighborhood added another layer of pressure. As neighbors began asking questions about why Emma's family had attracted such attention, Mrs. O'Malley reported that the man had been asking about Emma's background, her relationship with Thomas, and her involvement in community organizing efforts. "People are starting to wonder what you're hiding," Mrs. O'Malley said gently. "Not that anyone thinks badly of you, but they're concerned about what kind of trouble might be coming to the neighborhood because of your family situation." The concern was legitimate. If Victoria Richardson decided to apply pressure against the community that had sheltered her daughter, she had the resources and connections to make life difficult for everyone in Southie. Zoning violations could be discovered and enforced, building permits could be delayed or denied, and city services could be reduced in ways that would affect every family in the neighborhood. Emma's greatest fear was that her presence in the community might bring consequences that would hurt people who had shown her nothing but kindness and support. The Irish families of Southie had enough challenges without adding the enmity of Boston's elite to their list of problems. The crisis that forced Emma to confront these competing pressures came when Michael developed a high fever that Dr. Murphy's basic medications couldn't reduce. The baby's temperature climbed throughout the night, despite every home remedy the neighborhood women could suggest, and by morning it was clear that Michael needed specialized medical care that wasn't available in Southie. Massachusetts General Hospital, where Boston's wealthy families received their medical care, had pediatric specialists who could diagnose and treat conditions that would overwhelm neighborhood doctors. But the hospital's admission policies made it clear that working-class families were expected to seek care at public facilities, with long waiting lists and overcrowded conditions. Emma found herself standing outside the hospital's marble entrance, holding her feverish son and calculating whether Thomas's construction wages would cover the cost of private medical care. The irony wasn't lost on her that Victoria's trust fund offer would eliminate such calculations, ensuring that Michael would always have access to the best medical care available. The decision to seek help from Dr. Hamilton Marsh, the pediatric specialist who had treated Emma during her own childhood illnesses, required swallowing pride and accepting that her son's welfare was more important than maintaining the complete separation from her former life that she had worked to achieve. Dr. Marsh's examination revealed that Michael was suffering from a serious but treatable infection that required immediate antibiotic treatment. The medication was expensive and would need to be administered under medical supervision for several days, but the prognosis was excellent if treatment began immediately. "You should have brought him in sooner," Dr. Marsh said as he prepared Michael's first injection. This kind of infection can become dangerous very quickly in infants, but it responds well to proper treatment. The medical bills that accumulated over the following week represented more money than Thomas earned in 2 months. Emma found herself facing exactly the kind of financial crisis that Victoria's offer was designed to prevent, and the timing felt too coincidental to be accidental. Standing in Michael's hospital room, watching her son recover while knowing that the cost of his treatment would devastate their family's finances, Emma realized that Victoria Richardson had probably orchestrated events to demonstrate the practical advantages of accepting her terms. The private investigator, the increased pressure on neighborhood institutions, even the timing of Michael's illness, all of it created a perfect storm of circumstances that made Victoria's offer seem like salvation rather than surrender. Thomas arrived at the hospital after another grueling day trying to save the bridge project, his clothes still covered with construction dust, and his face showing the strain of carrying responsibilities that kept expanding beyond his control. The sight of his exhausted husband, holding their recovering son while surrounded by medical bills they couldn't afford, crystallized Emma's understanding of the choice she was facing. She could continue fighting to maintain their independence while risking Michael's future security, or she could accept Victoria's terms and ensure their son would never face the kind of financial desperation that made medical emergencies into family catastrophes. The decision would determine not just their immediate circumstances, but the entire trajectory of Michael's life and the kind of man he would become. Victoria Richardson arrived in Southie without warning on a cold October morning, stepping out of a chauffeured-driven Packard that drew curious stares from everyone on the street. She wore a tailored wool coat that cost more than most families in the neighborhood earned in a year, and her bearing carried the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to having her presence command immediate attention. Emma was hanging laundry in the back alley when Mrs. O'Malley burst through the bakery's rear door with news that would change everything. "There's a lady here asking for you," she said breathlessly. "Expensive lady with a driver and everything. Says she's your mother." The basket of wet clothes slipped from Emma's hands as the reality of direct confrontation hit her like a physical blow. For over a year, she had managed to keep her two worlds separate through careful planning and deliberate distance. Victoria's appearance in Southie meant that separation was ending, whether Emma was prepared for it or not. Emma found Victoria standing in the bakery's front room, examining the simple furnishings and modest displays with the critical assessment of someone evaluating property for potential purchase. The contrast between Victoria's elegant appearance and the working-class environment was so stark that it seemed to highlight every difference between the life Emma had been born into and the life she had chosen to build. "Emma," Victoria said, her voice carrying the same cool authority that had marked their final confrontation on Beacon Hill. "You look well, considering your circumstances." The careful phrasing contained layers of implication that Emma understood immediately. Victoria was acknowledging Emma's physical health while simultaneously suggesting that her overall situation remained problematic and temporary. "Mother," Emma replied, maintaining her composure despite the shock of seeing Victoria in this context. "I received your letter. I assume that's why you're here." Victoria's gaze moved past Emma to the narrow staircase leading to the apartment upstairs. "I'd like to meet my grandson, and I think we should have a private conversation about his future." The request was delivered with the tone of someone making a reasonable suggestion, but Emma recognized the underlying demand. Victoria had come to inspect Emma's living situation, evaluate Thomas as a potential son-in-law, and present her terms for reconciliation in person, where the full weight of her authority could be brought to bear. Emma led Victoria upstairs to the small apartment, acutely aware of how cramped and simple everything must appear to someone accustomed to rooms designed for entertaining dozens of guests. The parlor furniture consisted of a second-hand sofa, 2 mismatched chairs, and a small table that served multiple purposes. The kitchen was barely large enough for one person to work comfortably, and the single bedroom was separated from the main living area by a thin wall that provided minimal privacy. Michael was sleeping in the wooden cradle Thomas had built with his own hands, his small face peaceful despite the tension that filled the room around him. Victoria approached the cradle with an expression Emma couldn't read, studying her grandson with the careful attention she might give to evaluating a piece of art or a business investment. "He's a beautiful child," Victoria said finally, and Emma caught a note of genuine emotion beneath her mother's controlled exterior. "He has the Richardson bone structure, though I can see his father's influence as well." The comment was typical of Victoria's approach to family matters, acknowledging blood connection while simultaneously asserting the superiority of her own genetic contribution. Emma bristled at the implication that Michael's value was somehow enhanced by his resemblance to the Richardson family line. "His name is Michael Thomas McKenna," Emma said firmly. "He's Thomas's son and mine, and he's growing up as part of this community." Victoria turned from the cradle to face Emma directly, her expression showing the kind of patience reserved for correcting particularly stubborn children. "That's exactly what I've come to discuss. This child deserves opportunities that his current circumstances cannot provide, and you have the power to ensure he receives them." What followed was a more detailed presentation of the offer Victoria had outlined in her letter, expanded with specific examples of what acceptance would mean for Michael's future. Private tutors, elite boarding schools, summers in Europe, connections that would guarantee admission to Harvard and entry into Boston's most exclusive social circles. "Look around you, Emma," Victoria said, gesturing toward the modest apartment. "This is the best your husband can provide despite working himself to exhaustion. Michael will grow up with limited horizons, inadequate educational opportunities, and social connections that will restrict his potential throughout his life." The argument was delivered with the logical precision that made Victoria formidable in business and social situations. She wasn't wrong about the material advantages her resources could provide, and Emma found herself struggling to articulate why those advantages weren't worth the cost. Victoria was demanding. The conversation was interrupted by Thomas's return from the construction site, his workday cut short by news that the bridge project had encountered another critical setback. He climbed the stairs with the heavy tread of someone carrying more weight than his shoulders could bear, and his expression when he saw Victoria sitting in their parlor showed immediate understanding of what her presence meant. "Mr. McKenna," Victoria said, rising to offer a handshake that Thomas accepted with obvious reluctance. "I'm Victoria Richardson, Emma's mother. I've come to discuss arrangements for my grandson's future." Thomas's response was everything Emma had expected: polite but guarded, clearly suspicious of Victoria's motives, while trying to maintain the courtesy appropriate for addressing his wife's mother. He settled into the chair beside Emma, his work roughened hands a stark contrast to Victoria's manicured elegance. "What kind of arrangements?" Thomas asked, his tone carefully neutral. Victoria repeated her offer with the same systematic precision she had used with Emma, outlining the financial benefits and social opportunities that would accompany acceptance of her terms. Thomas listened without interruption, his expression growing increasingly serious as the implications became clear. "You're asking us to pretend our marriage isn't real," Thomas said when Victoria finished her presentation. "To raise our son as if his father's background is something shameful that needs to be hidden or overcome." Victoria's response revealed the fundamental gulf between her worldview and the values that guided Thomas's life. "I'm asking you to prioritize your son's welfare over your personal pride. Surely a loving father would want his child to have every possible advantage, regardless of the personal cost." The argument that followed exposed the core conflict between two completely different philosophies about what constituted a successful life. Victoria spoke of opportunities, connections, and the doors that money could open for Michael's future. Thomas countered with values like integrity, community, and the importance of honest work that contributed something meaningful to the world. Money without character produces men who are useless to everyone, including themselves, Thomas said, his voice rising despite his efforts to remain calm. I'd rather my son grow up poor and honest than rich and ashamed of where he came from. Victoria's patience finally began to show cracks as she faced opposition that couldn't be overcome through financial pressure or social authority. Your idealism is admirable, Mr. McKenna, but it won't pay for Michael's education or ensure his acceptance in the circles that determine success in this city. Emma found herself caught between two people she loved, each presenting arguments that contained undeniable truth. Victoria was right about the practical advantages her resources could provide. Thomas was right about the moral cost of accepting those advantages under the conditions Victoria was demanding. The confrontation reached its climax when Victoria made the strategic error of suggesting that Thomas's love for his family would be better demonstrated through stepping aside than through continued resistance to her plans. A truly selfless man would recognize that his presence in Michael's life limits the boy's opportunities, Victoria said, her voice carrying the kind of coldness that had dominated Emma's childhood. Sometimes love requires sacrifice, Mr. McKenna. Sometimes it requires putting a child's needs above a parent's desires. Thomas's response was immediate and devastating in its quiet intensity. Mrs. Richardson, with all due respect, you threw your pregnant daughter out of your house because you were embarrassed by her choices. I don't think you're qualified to lecture me about parental sacrifice. The silence that followed was absolute. Victoria had spent her adult life in social situations where her authority was unquestioned and her opinions were received with deference. Thomas's direct challenge to her moral standing was unlike anything she had encountered in decades of wielding social power. Emma watched her mother struggle to formulate a response that could restore her position of authority while addressing the accuracy of Thomas's accusation. Victoria's abandonment of her daughter during pregnancy represented exactly the kind of selfish choice she was now criticizing Thomas for making. I made a difficult decision based on what I believed was best for everyone involved, Victoria said. Finally, her voice lacking its usual confidence. I'm trying to correct that mistake by ensuring my grandson has opportunities I failed to provide for Emma. Thomas's reply cut through Victoria's rationalization with surgical precision. You're trying to control what you couldn't control before. This isn't about Michael's welfare. It's about your need to manage how your family looks to the outside world. The accuracy of Thomas's assessment was confirmed by Victoria's reaction. For the first time since arriving in Southie, she appeared genuinely shaken, her carefully maintained composure cracking under the weight of truths she had spent months avoiding. Emma realized that the moment had come for her to choose definitively between the two worlds that had shaped her life. Victoria's offer remained on the table, with all its practical advantages and moral compromises. Thomas's position was equally clear. They would build their life together based on their own efforts and values, regardless of the limitations that choice might impose on Michael's opportunities. Mother, Emma said, her voice stronger than she felt, I appreciate what you're trying to offer, but I can't accept conditions that require me to be ashamed of my husband or the life we've built together. Victoria's final argument was delivered with the desperation of someone watching a carefully planned strategy collapse. You're condemning your son to a life of limitations because you're too proud to admit you made a mistake. This neighborhood, this marriage, this entire situation, it's all the result of poor judgment that you're now forcing Michael to pay for. Emma stood and walked to Michael's cradle, lifting her sleeping son into her arms. The weight of him, the trust implicit in his peaceful expression, crystallized her understanding of what truly mattered in the choice she was making. Michael isn't paying for my mistakes, Emma said, holding her son close while facing her mother with complete certainty. He's benefiting from the best decision I ever made, choosing love over convenience. Authenticity over appearance, community over isolation. Victoria's departure was as dramatic as her arrival, accomplished with the kind of dignified fury that marked someone unaccustomed to having their authority completely rejected. She paused at the door to deliver a final warning about the consequences of refusing her assistance, but her threats carried less weight after Thomas's systematic dismantling of her moral authority. "You'll regret this decision when reality forces you to confront the limitations you're accepting," Victoria said. "And when that happens, don't expect me to offer these terms again." After Victoria left, Emma and Thomas sat in their small parlor, holding their son and processing what had just occurred. The confrontation had clarified the choice they were making and the values they were committing to uphold, but it had also highlighted the real challenges they would face in providing for Michael's future without the resources Victoria had offered. "We'll find our own way," Thomas said quietly, stroking Michael's hair while Emma leaned against his shoulder. "It might be harder, but it will be honest. Our son will grow up knowing his parents chose each other and chose him over everything else that was offered to us." Emma nodded, feeling the peace that came with making difficult decisions based on authentic values rather than external pressure. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together as a family, supported by a community that valued character over wealth and integrity over social position. Outside, the sounds of Southie continued, children playing, neighbors calling to each other, the familiar rhythm of working-class life that had become the backdrop for Emma's happiness. This was the world she had chosen for her son, and despite its limitations, it was a world where love mattered more than money and where people were valued for who they were rather than what they owned. 5 years later, Emma McKenna stood in the sunlit kitchen of the house Thomas had built with his own hands, watching her son Michael chase butterflies in the garden that had become the pride of their neighborhood. The morning light caught the copper highlights in her hair, and her face showed the contentment that came from choices made with integrity rather than convenience. The house on Maple Street represented everything Emma and Thomas had worked to achieve through years of patient determination and mutual support. Thomas's promotion to construction supervisor had provided the steady income necessary to purchase the lot, while Emma's expanding tutoring business had supplied the additional funds needed for materials and finishing touches that made their dwelling a true home. The structure itself was modest but beautifully crafted, with attention to detail that reflected Thomas's pride in his work and his commitment to building something that would last for generations. Wide windows filled every room with natural light. Handcrafted built-in bookcases lined the walls of the front parlor, and a spacious kitchen allowed Emma to prepare meals for the frequent guests who had become an integral part of their families' life. Michael had grown into a confident, curious child whose enthusiasm for learning reflected the educational opportunities Emma and Thomas had created through their own efforts rather than inherited privilege. The boy spoke with the slight Irish accent he had absorbed from neighborhood children, read voraciously from books Emma selected from the public library, and demonstrated the kind of practical problem-solving skills that came from watching his father approach every challenge with methodical intelligence. "Mama, look what I found," Michael called from the garden, running toward the house with a caterpillar cupped carefully in his small hands. "Mrs. O'Malley says it will turn into a butterfly if I take good care of it." Emma smiled as she examined Michael's discovery, marveling at how completely her son belonged to this world she had once thought was beneath her social station. The boy had never known material want, but more importantly, he had never known the emotional distance that had characterized Emma's own childhood among Boston's elite. The transformation in Emma's relationship with the Southie community had been gradual but profound. What had begun as grateful acceptance of assistance during her pregnancy had evolved into genuine leadership as Emma's education and organizational skills proved invaluable in addressing challenges that affected all working-class families. School fight that had once seemed hopeless had been won through a combination of community organizing, political pressure, and Emma's ability to navigate bureaucratic systems that had previously intimidated neighborhood advocates. The local elementary school not only remained open, but had expanded its programs to include evening classes for adults seeking to improve their literacy and job skills. Emma's role in coordinating these educational programs had led to her appointment as the school's first community liaison, a position that provided income while allowing her to use her talents in service of families who had become her chosen community. The work was deeply satisfying in ways that her previous charity activities had never been, because it involved direct engagement with real problems rather than symbolic gestures designed to maintain social appearances. Thomas's career had flourished as his reputation for competence and integrity spread throughout Boston's construction industry. The bridge project that had once threatened to destroy his prospects had ultimately become the foundation for his advancement, demonstrating his ability to solve complex problems under pressure while maintaining the respect and loyalty of his crews. His current position as senior supervisor with Callahan Construction Company provided not just financial security, but genuine influence over projects that shaped the city's development. Thomas had used that influence to ensure that working-class neighborhoods received fair consideration in city planning decisions, protecting communities like Southie from the kind of predatory development schemes that had once threatened their existence. The success Thomas had achieved through merit rather than family connections had earned him respect from colleagues who might otherwise have dismissed him based on his background. His advice was sought by younger workers seeking advancement, and his recommendations carried weight with company executives who valued his judgment about personnel and project management. The marriage between Emma and Thomas had deepened through years of shared challenges and mutual support that had tested and strengthened their commitment to each other. They had faced financial pressures, health scares, family conflicts, and professional setbacks together, each crisis revealing new dimensions of their partnership and building confidence in their ability to handle whatever difficulties the future might bring. Their relationship was built on the kind of equality that Emma had never seen modeled in her parents' marriage or in the social circles where she had grown up. Thomas valued Emma's intelligence and sought her advice on important decisions, while Emma respected Thomas's expertise and supported his professional ambitions. They shared household responsibilities, child-rearing duties, and financial planning in ways that reflected their mutual respect rather than traditional gender roles. The physical intimacy they shared had evolved from the desperate passion of their early relationship into something deeper and more sustaining, a connection that provided comfort during difficult times and celebration during moments of joy. Emma had discovered that love expressed within the context of genuine partnership was far more satisfying than the romantic idealization she had once imagined was the height of emotional fulfillment. Michael's presence had added dimensions to their marriage that neither Emma nor Thomas had fully anticipated. Watching their son grow and develop had revealed new aspects of each other's character while creating shared purposes that extended far beyond their individual needs and desires. The responsibility of raising a child had deepened their commitment to the community that would shape his values and the future they were building for his benefit. The broader family that surrounded the McKennas had evolved to include chosen relatives, whose bonds were strengthened by mutual affection and shared experience rather than blood connection or legal obligation. Mrs. O'Malley had become a grandmother figure to Michael, providing the kind of unconditional love and practical wisdom that enriched his childhood in ways no amount of money could purchase. Margaret Flynn continued to serve as Emma's mentor and closest friend, their relationship having deepened through years of collaboration on community projects and shared confidences about the challenges of navigating life as women with ambitions that extended beyond traditional domestic roles. Margaret's own success in establishing a network of schools serving working-class Neighborhoods had provided a model for the kind of meaningful work Emma aspired to accomplish. Dr. Murphy had become not just the family's physician, but a trusted advisor whose medical expertise was supplemented by genuine concern for the McKenna's welfare. His treatment of Michael's childhood illnesses had been provided at cost, and his guidance during Emma's difficult second pregnancy had been invaluable in ensuring both mother and baby remained healthy. The second pregnancy, which had ended in miscarriage during Emma's 4th month, had tested the family's resilience in ways that success and happiness couldn't. The loss had been devastating for both Emma and Thomas, but it had also demonstrated the strength of the support network they had built within their community. Neighbors had provided meals, childcare for Michael, and emotional support that had helped them process their grief without becoming isolated in their sorrow. The experience had also clarified Emma and Thomas's gratitude for Michael's health and their commitment to providing him with siblings when circumstances permitted. Emma was currently pregnant again, and while she remained cautious about making plans too far in advance, both she and Thomas were hopeful that their family would continue to grow. The question of Michael's education had been resolved through a combination of public schooling, supplemented by the kind of enrichment activities that Emma's own background enabled her to provide. Michael attended the neighborhood elementary school where he learned alongside children from similar families, but his afternoons were filled with music lessons, library visits, and educational outings that broadened his knowledge and cultural awareness. Emma had discovered that her elite education provided tools for enhancing her son's learning without creating the kind of social isolation she had experienced as a child. Michael would grow up bilingual, culturally literate, and academically prepared for higher education, but he would also understand the value of honest work and the importance of community connection. The financial security that had once seemed impossible without Victoria Richardson's assistance had been achieved through careful planning, mutual support, and the kind of incremental progress that marked sustainable success. The McKennas owned their home, maintained savings for emergencies and Michael's future education, and lived comfortably within their means without the constant anxiety that had characterized Emma's early months of independence. More importantly, their security was based on their own efforts and community relationships rather than dependence on external benefactors whose support might come with conditions that compromised their autonomy or values. Emma and Thomas had learned that true security came not from inherited wealth, but from personal competence, mutual support, and the respect of people whose opinions mattered to them. The relationship with Victoria Richardson had settled into a pattern of distant civility that acknowledged family connection while respecting the boundaries Emma and Thomas had established around their independence. Victoria sent birthday gifts for Michael that were expensive but appropriate, and she maintained polite correspondence with Emma that avoided the kinds of manipulative pressure that had characterized her earlier attempts at reconciliation. Understanding between them was unspoken but clear. Victoria could be Michael's grandmother within limits that Emma and Thomas defined, but she could not be the controlling influence in his upbringing that she had once attempted to become. The arrangement wasn't perfect, but it allowed for family connection without compromising the values and relationships that had become central to the McKenna's happiness. As Emma watched Michael play in the garden Thomas had planted for him, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from the desperate girl thrown out of a Beacon Hill mansion to the confident woman who had found her place in a community that valued character over pedigree. The transformation hadn't been easy, but it had been authentic in ways that her privileged childhood had never been. Michael ran toward the house calling for his father, and Emma smiled as Thomas appeared from his workshop carrying the wooden toy he had been crafting during his evening hours. The sight of her husband and son working together, their heads bent over Thomas's latest creation, filled Emma with the kind of contentment that no amount of social status or inherited wealth could have provided. This was the life she had chosen when she rejected Victoria's offer, a life built on love rather than convenience, community rather than isolation, authenticity rather than pretense. It was a life that required constant effort and attention, but it was genuinely their own in ways that nothing she had known during her years of privilege had ever been. The future stretched ahead with possibilities that Emma and Thomas would shape together through their own choices and efforts. Michael would grow up knowing he was loved completely, supported unconditionally, and prepared for whatever path he chose to follow. The community that had embraced them would continue to benefit from their contributions while providing the support and connection that made all their individual successes meaningful. Emma McKenna had discovered that true wealth wasn't measured in bank accounts or social connections, but in the depth of relationships built on mutual respect and shared values. She was rich in ways that Victoria Richardson had never been, and her son would inherit that richness as his birthright, not because of the family he was born into, but because of the family his parents had chosen to create. 15 years had passed since Emma McKenna first walked down the aisle of St. Patrick's Cathedral as the matron of honor at her son Michael's wedding, her heart swelling with pride as she watched the young man she and Thomas had raised claim his place in the world with confidence and grace. The cathedral was filled not with Boston's elite, but with the extended family of friends, neighbors, and colleagues who had supported the McKenna family through decades of shared joys and challenges. Michael Thomas McKenna, now 20 years old, stood at the altar in a suit Thomas had helped him select, his arm around Sarah Catherine O'Brien, the daughter of a local police sergeant who had captured his heart during their final year at Boston Latin School. The wedding represented everything Emma had hoped for when she made her choice to reject Victoria Richardson's conditions, a celebration rooted in authentic love rather than social advancement, witnessed by people who valued character over pedigree. Emma's second son, Daniel Patrick McKenna, now 14, served as his brother's best man, his serious expression reflecting the responsibility he felt in representing the family during such an important moment. Daniel had inherited Thomas's analytical mind and Emma's educational passion, earning scholarships that would allow him to attend Boston College in the fall while remaining connected to the community that had shaped his values. The youngest McKenna child, 6-year-old Catherine Rose, named for the grandmother she had never met, sat between Emma and Thomas in the front pew, her dark curls crowned with flowers and her bright eyes taking in every detail of the ceremony that would become a treasured memory for the entire family. Catherine's presence represented the completion of the family Emma and Thomas had built together through years of love, loss, and unwavering commitment to each other and their community. Thomas, now 43 years old, had evolved from the young construction worker who had won Emma's heart into one of Boston's most respected building contractors. His company, McKenna and Associates, employed over 200 workers and had earned a reputation for projects that combined innovative engineering with respect for the neighborhoods they served. The success Thomas had achieved was built on the same principles of integrity and community service that had first attracted Emma to him. He remained the man who valued honest work and authentic relationships above personal advancement. Emma herself had become a force for educational reform throughout Massachusetts, her work expanding from community organizing to state-level advocacy for policies that ensured working-class children received the same quality education as their wealthy counterparts. Her appointment to the State Board of Education had been unanimous, recognition of her ability to bridge class divides, while never forgetting her commitment to the families who had welcomed her when she had nowhere else to turn. The programs Emma had developed in Southie had become models for similar initiatives throughout New England. The evening literacy classes that had begun in a single classroom now operated in dozens of communities, providing educational opportunities for immigrant families and working adults who had been denied schooling in their youth. Emma's advocacy had secured state funding for these programs, ensuring their sustainability while maintaining their focus on practical skills and community connection. The relationship between Emma and Victoria Richardson had evolved into something neither woman could have predicted during their confrontational meeting in the small apartment above Mrs. O'Malley's bakery. Victoria's gradual recognition that Emma had indeed built something valuable and valuable in Southie had led to a careful reconciliation that respected the boundaries Emma and Thomas had established while allowing for genuine family connection. Victoria's transformation had begun when Michael, then 12 years old, had spent a summer helping Thomas with construction projects around the neighborhood. The boy's enthusiasm for his father's work, his respectful treatment of the men on Thomas's crews, and his obvious pride in contributing to community projects had challenged Victoria's assumptions about the limitations of working-class life. He speaks 3 languages, reads voraciously, and understands more about engineering principles than most college graduates, Victoria had observed to Emma during one of their increasingly frequent conversations. And yet he's completely comfortable working with his hands and solving practical problems. I'm beginning to understand what you and Thomas have accomplished. The understanding that had developed between Emma and her mother was based on mutual respect rather than capitulation by either party. Victoria had learned to value the authentic accomplishments of her daughter's chosen family, while Emma had come to appreciate her mother's genuine concern for her grandchildren's welfare, even when it was expressed through methods she couldn't accept. Victoria's support for Emma's educational advocacy work had proved invaluable in navigating the political challenges that accompanied reform efforts. Victoria's connections among Boston's elite had opened doors that might otherwise have remained closed, while her financial contributions had supplemented state funding in ways that allowed programs to expand more rapidly than bureaucratic budgets typically permitted. The collaboration between mother and daughter had created something neither could have achieved independently: educational initiatives that combined Victoria's resources and political connections with Emma's understanding of community needs and grassroots organizing experience. Their joint efforts had resulted in legislation that required equal per-pupil funding across all Massachusetts school districts, regardless of local property values. Michael's education had exemplified the synthesis Emma and Thomas had created between academic excellence and community connection. Their son had graduated valedictorian from Boston Latin School while maintaining close friendships with children from the neighborhood, participating in community service projects, and working summers with his father's construction crews to understand the value of manual labor. Harvard University had offered Michael a full scholarship based on his academic achievements, but he had chosen instead to attend Boston University's engineering program, which allowed him to remain connected to his family and community while pursuing the technical education that would prepare him for a career in construction management. His decision reflected the values Emma and Thomas had instilled, that success was measured not by prestige but by the contribution one made to improving the world around them. Daniel's path was leading toward law school, inspired by his observation of the legal challenges that had complicated Emma's community organizing efforts. His goal was to become an advocate for working-class families facing housing discrimination, employment disputes, and educational barriers that prevented them from achieving their full potential. Like his older brother, Daniel had been offered opportunities to attend elite institutions, but his commitment to serving his community influenced his educational choices. The McKenna family's success had created ripple effects throughout Southie and similar neighborhoods across Boston. Thomas's construction company prioritized hiring from local communities, providing training opportunities that allowed young men to develop valuable skills while contributing to projects that improved their own neighborhoods. The wages Thomas paid exceeded industry standards, reflecting his belief that workers deserved compensation that allowed them to support their families with dignity. Emma's educational programs had produced hundreds of adults who had earned high school equivalency diplomas, learned English as a second language, or developed job skills that qualified them for better employment opportunities. Many of these graduates had gone on to start their own businesses, pursue higher education, or become community leaders in their own right, creating a network of influence that extended far beyond Emma's original organizing efforts. The house on Maple Street had become an informal community center where neighbors gathered to discuss local issues, celebrate important events, and plan collaborative responses to challenges that affected everyone in the area. Emma's kitchen table had hosted meetings that resulted in improved city services, successful political campaigns for candidates who represented working-class interests, and business partnerships that created economic opportunities within the community. Mrs. O'Malley, now in her 80s, remained a vital presence in the neighborhood, her bakery serving as both a successful business and a gathering place where information was shared and mutual support was coordinated. Her relationship with the McKenna family had evolved from helpful neighbor to chosen grandmother, and her influence on the children's development had been profound and lasting. Margaret Flynn had become the superintendent of Boston's largest school district, a position she used to implement the kind of systematic reforms that Emma had pioneered on a smaller scale. Their partnership had continued through the years, with Emma's grassroots experience complementing Margaret's administrative expertise in ways that had transformed educational opportunities for thousands of children. Dr. Murphy had trained several younger physicians in the community-based medical practice he had developed, ensuring that working-class families would continue to receive quality health care from doctors who understood their needs and respected their circumstances. His collaboration with Emma on public health initiatives had resulted in preventive care programs that had significantly improved health outcomes for children and adults throughout the area. The wedding celebration that followed Michael's ceremony took place not in an exclusive hotel, but in the parish hall of St. Patrick's Church, decorated with flowers grown in neighborhood gardens and filled with food prepared by women who had learned their recipes from mothers and grandmothers who had crossed oceans seeking better lives for their families. The music was provided by musicians from the community, and the dancing continued late into the evening as 3 generations celebrated together. Emma watched her eldest son dance with his new wife while Thomas spun young Catherine around the floor to delighted laughter, and she marveled at how completely their family belonged to this celebration and this community. The love that surrounded them was earned rather than inherited, based on years of shared experience rather than blood connection or social obligation. As the evening wound down and family members began the familiar ritual of cleaning up after a community celebration, Emma found herself standing in the church garden with Victoria, who had traveled from Beacon Hill to attend her grandson's wedding. The two women had grown more comfortable with each other over the years, their relationship built on mutual respect for what each had accomplished, rather than attempts to change each other's fundamental values. "You were right," Victoria said quietly, watching Michael and Sarah accept congratulations from the construction workers, who had known the young man since childhood. "This is what happiness looks like. This is what real success means." Emma smiled, understanding that her mother's acknowledgement represented not defeat but growth. Victoria had learned to see value in ways of life she had once dismissed, while Emma had learned to appreciate her mother's genuine desire to contribute to her grandchildren's welfare, even when her methods needed adjustment. The McKenna family had become living proof that authentic success was possible for people willing to choose love over convenience, community over isolation, and integrity over expedience. Their story had inspired others facing similar choices, demonstrating that happiness built on genuine values was more sustainable than comfort purchased through compromise with principles that mattered. As Emma and Thomas walked home through the familiar streets of Southie, surrounded by the sounds and sights of the neighborhood that had become their true home, they reflected on the journey that had brought them from desperate young people in Quanpun, love to respected community leaders with grown children building families of their own. The life they had built together was exactly what Emma had hoped for when she rejected Victoria's conditional offer of support 15 years earlier. It was based on authentic relationships, meaningful work, and the kind of security that came from being valued by people whose opinions mattered. Their children would carry these values into their own futures, creating ripple effects that would extend far beyond what Emma and Thomas could imagine. Emma McKenna had indeed found her sacred treasure, not in the gold offered by those who would control her choices, but in the love freely given by those who valued her authentic self. And that treasure would continue to enrich lives for generations to come. 25 years after, Emma Richardson McKenna first walked down the marble steps of her mother's Beacon Hill mansion with nothing but a suitcase and an unborn child. She stood before the Massachusetts State Legislature as the keynote speaker for the signing of the Universal Education Access Act legislation that would guarantee equal educational opportunities for every child in the Commonwealth, regardless of their family's economic circumstances. The woman who addressed the packed chamber bore little resemblance to the desperate girl who had once sought shelter in a boarding house, surviving on department store wages while hiding her pregnancy from suspicious landlords. Emma's silver-streaked hair was pulled back in the practical style that had become her trademark, and her simple navy dress reflected the understated elegance of someone who had learned that true authority came from competence rather than expensive accessories. At 57, Emma had become one of the most influential voices in American education policy. Her insights sought by federal officials crafting national initiatives to address inequality in schools, serving different economic communities. Her autobiography, Sacred Treasure: Finding Wealth in Authentic Love, had spent 18 months on bestseller lists, inspiring thousands of readers facing their own impossible choices between security and integrity. But for Emma, the most meaningful moment of this legislative triumph was seeing Thomas in the gallery, his weathered hands applauding with the same quiet pride that had sustained their marriage through decades of shared challenges and victories. Beside him sat their 3 children, Michael, now 35 and a successful civil engineer, Daniel, 29 and a civil rights attorney, and Catherine Rose, 21 and completing her final year at Harvard Medical School with plans to practice community medicine. The legislation being signed represented the culmination of work that had begun in Emma's small apartment above Mrs. O'Malley's bakery, where she had first discovered her gift for organizing neighbors around shared concerns. The Universal Education Access Act would require wealthy school districts to share resources with underfunded systems, provide state-funded enrichment programs in underserved communities, and establish accountability measures that ensured all children received preparation for higher education or skilled careers. Governor Patricia Walsh, the first woman to hold Massachusetts' highest office, had specifically requested that Emma deliver the keynote address, recognizing her unique perspective as someone who had experienced both sides of the economic divide that the legislation was designed to bridge. 25 years ago, Emma began, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber. I was a young woman who thought wealth meant having enough money to avoid life's difficulties. I believed security came from being born into the right family, knowing the right people, and maintaining the right appearances. The audience listened with the respectful attention that marked recognition of authentic authority, many of them familiar with Emma's story through her book and her years of advocacy, work that had brought her to this moment of legislative triumph. I learned that real wealth isn't measured in bank accounts or social connections, Emma continued, but in the depth of relationships built on mutual respect and shared values. The families who welcomed me when I had nothing taught me that true security comes from being part of a community where people care about each other's welfare and work together to solve common problems. The speech that followed wove together personal narrative and policy analysis, demonstrating how Emma's individual transformation had prepared her to understand and address systemic barriers that prevented working-class children from achieving their full potential. She spoke of Mrs. O'Malley's wisdom, Margaret Flynn's mentorship, and the countless neighbors who had shared their knowledge and support during her family's journey from desperation to stability. This legislation honors the truth that every child deserves access to excellent education, regardless of the circumstances of their birth, Emma concluded. It recognizes that our Commonwealth is strongest when we invest in all our children's potential, not just those whose families can afford private tutors and elite schools. The standing ovation that followed lasted several minutes, with legislators from both parties recognizing that Emma's advocacy had created bipartisan support for education reform that might otherwise have been impossible to achieve. Her ability to connect policy proposals to human stories had built coalitions that transcended traditional political divisions. After the ceremony, Emma found herself surrounded by colleagues, reporters, and other advocates seeking her thoughts on implementation strategies for the new legislation. But her attention was focused on the familiar figure waiting patiently at the edge of the crowd, Victoria Richardson, now 78 years old, leaning on an elegant walking stick, but still carrying herself with the dignified bearing that had once intimidated Boston's most powerful families. The relationship between Emma and her mother had evolved through years of careful negotiation into something neither woman could have imagined during their confrontational meeting in Southie. Decades earlier, Victoria's gradual recognition of Emma's accomplishments had led to genuine respect for her daughter's choices, while Emma's growing confidence had allowed her to appreciate her mother's genuine desire to contribute positively to her grandchildren's lives. "I'm proud of you," Victoria said simply as Emma approached, her words carrying the weight of acknowledgement that had been decades in the making. "This legislation will help thousands of families, and it exists because you had the courage to choose love over convenience when you were young and frightened." The embrace they shared was witnessed by reporters who had covered their family story for years, documenting the gradual reconciliation that had become a symbol of how apparently irreconcilable differences could be bridged through patience, respect, and genuine commitment to shared values. Thomas joined them with their children and grandchildren, Michael's twin daughters, now 10 years old, and Daniel's infant son, born just 3 months earlier. The 4 generations of family represented the living legacy of choices Emma had made as a desperate young woman with nowhere to turn. The celebration that followed took place not in an exclusive restaurant, but in the same parish hall where Michael's wedding had been held years earlier, now filled with friends, colleagues, and community members who had supported Emma's advocacy work throughout her career. The gathering included construction workers who had known Thomas since his early days in the industry, teachers who had implemented Emma's educational innovations, and former students who had benefited from programs she had developed. Mrs. O'Malley, now 89 but still sharp and determined, had insisted on providing the desserts for the celebration, her famous Irish soda bread and butter cookies, representing the continuity of relationships that had anchored Emma's life through all its transformations. Her presence at the event demonstrated the enduring bonds that connected Emma's current success to the community that had first welcomed her when she had nothing to offer but desperate need and willingness to work. Margaret Flynn, recently retired from her position as State Superintendent of Education, served as the evening's master of ceremonies, her remarks highlighting the systematic changes that had resulted from Emma's grassroots organizing efforts. The programs that had begun in Southie now operated in over 200 communities across New England, providing educational opportunities for adults while strengthening the social fabric that held working-class neighborhoods together. Dr. Murphy, now in his 70s but still practicing medicine in the community clinic he had established with Emma's help, spoke about the health improvements that had accompanied educational gains in the neighborhoods where their programs operated. Better educated parents made more informed decisions about their children's medical care, sought preventive services more consistently, and created home environments that supported both physical and intellectual development. The evening's most moving moment came when Catherine Rose McKenna, Emma's youngest daughter, rose to speak about the legacy she and her siblings had inherited from their parents' choices. At 21, Catherine possessed the poise and confidence that came from growing up in a family where love was expressed through daily actions rather than material gifts, where success was measured by contribution to community welfare rather than personal advancement. My mother often tells the story of the night she was thrown out of her family home, carrying nothing but a suitcase and the hope that love might be enough to build a life on. Catherine said, her voice carrying the strength that marked her generation of McKennas. What she couldn't have known then was that the treasure she was seeking wasn't something that could be given or taken away by other people's approval or disapproval. Catherine's remarks drew connections between her family's personal story and the broader themes that the Universal Education Access Act was designed to address, demonstrating how individual choices about values and priorities could create systemic changes that affected entire communities. The sacred treasure my parents found wasn't gold or silver or social status, Catherine continued. It was the discovery that authentic love that doesn't demand you become someone else to earn it, creates wealth that can't be measured in dollars but can be passed from generation to generation through example and commitment. The audience's response to Catherine's speech reflected recognition that Emma and Thomas's legacy was being carried forward by children who understood both the privileges they had inherited and the responsibilities that accompanied those advantages. All three McKenna children had chosen careers focused on public service, using the educational opportunities their parents had provided to address problems affecting people who faced the same kinds of barriers Emma had once encountered. As the evening concluded and family members began the familiar ritual of cleaning up after a community celebration, Emma found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her from desperate flight to legislative triumph. The path had been marked by challenges she couldn't have anticipated and rewards she couldn't have imagined when she first knocked on Thomas's construction trailer seeking honest conversation about an impossible situation, the apartment above Mrs. O'Malley's Bakery, where Emma and Thomas had begun their married life with nothing but love and determination, had been preserved as a community center where young families could access resources and support during their own difficult transitions. Emma visited regularly, meeting with women facing challenges similar to those she had once confronted, offering both practical assistance and living proof that authentic success was possible for people willing to choose integrity over expedience. Thomas, now 58 and gradually transitioning leadership of his construction company to younger partners, had become a mentor to men seeking advancement in the building trades. His reputation for fairness and competence had created opportunities for hundreds of workers who might otherwise have been limited to temporary employment with no possibility for career development. The house on Maple Street remained the McKenna family headquarters, though it had been expanded over the years to accommodate children, grandchildren, and the steady stream of visitors who sought Emma's advice about community organizing or educational advocacy. The garden Thomas had planted for Michael now bloomed under the care of his granddaughters, who were learning the same lessons about patience, responsibility, and the rewards of nurturing growth that had shaped their father's childhood. Victoria Richardson had established a foundation that funded educational initiatives in working-class communities throughout Massachusetts, her resources now directed toward the same goals Emma pursued through grassroots organizing. The collaboration between mother and daughter had evolved into genuine partnership, their different strengths combining to create more effective advocacy than either woman could have accomplished independently. The Universal Education Access Act would benefit thousands of children who would never know Emma's name, but whose opportunities would be expanded because a frightened young woman had once chosen love over security and discovered that authentic relationships created more lasting wealth than inherited privilege. The legislation represented the institutionalization of values Emma and Thomas had lived by throughout their marriage, that every person deserved respect, every child deserved opportunity, and every community deserved investment in its potential for growth and improvement. As Emma and Thomas walked home through the familiar streets of Southie, now gentrified, but still maintaining the sense of community that had first welcomed them, they reflected on the sacred treasure they had discovered through their willingness to choose each other over easier alternatives. Their treasure hadn't been hidden in some distant location requiring dangerous journeys to claim. It had been present in every act of mutual support, every moment of authentic connection, every choice to prioritize love over convenience. The wealth they had accumulated couldn't be measured in financial statements, but it could be seen in the lives they had touched, the community they had helped build, and the children they had raised to value character over status. Emma McKenna had indeed found her sacred treasure, and in finding it, she had learned the most important truth of all, that genuine wealth is created when people choose to love authentically, serve selflessly, and build something together that none of them could have achieved alone. The treasure was not a destination to be reached, but a way of living to be shared, and its value increased every time it was given away. The legacy would continue through their children, their grandchildren, and the countless lives that had been changed because a young woman had once decided that love was worth any risk, and a young man had proved that her faith was justified. This was the sacred treasure that could never be lost, stolen, or diminished. The wealth of authentic love shared freely and received gratefully by people brave enough to choose truth over comfort, community over isolation, and integrity over expedience. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.